2020. I am Seth Leibsohn. This is your show. Yesterday, we had a caller suggest we invent and invoke a phrase entitled the Nancy Pelosi alert system, a way to determine when things are about to go, shall we say, very wobbly politically, based on stuntsmanship combined with a lacunae or gap in common sense. The greater the strain, the lower the number on the scale, sort of like a political DEFCON or defense readiness condition. I'll give you, for instance, an example. If Nancy Pelosi or some other Democrat says there will be no impeachment unless the cause and sense of it is, quote, compelling, overwhelming, and bipartisan, close quote, as she said last year, that's about a 4.5. Fairly innocent, fairly common sense, but why not a full number 5? Because you know the sentiment will likely not hold. She will likely abandon it. You can't take it to the bank. Innocent on its merits, but not firm. Try another example. If she says she and the Democratic Party do not tolerate anti-Semitism, that's more like a 4. You wish it were true, we all wish it were true, but you know it's not. Say, for example, you believe in anti-Semitism is a terrible thing, but a member or 2 or 3 of your caucus continue to traffic in it, even after being warned about it, and a bill of denunciation of those sentiments were to come up against that congressman and her statements in the House of Representatives, you move from your 4 to a 2.5 when you vitiate and water it down so much that it never touches that congressman or woman, never mentioning them, and includes every other woke group you can imagine to make sure it's further extenuated. If Nancy Pelosi tells you we are in a constitutional crisis, that might be a 2. Why is it a 2? Because it's an extravagant spin of hyperbole. It's a phrase reserved for something with little remedy and a direct threat to our democracy, our rights, a symbolic alarm of great urgency. You might think about certain things being done in the Nixon administration being some close examples. But now consider, if you can remember at all, why Nancy Pelosi even said we were in a constitutional crisis last April. Anyone remember? It was because, get this, hold on to your seats, Attorney General William Barr wouldn't send an unredacted copy of the Mueller report to the House of Representatives. You know, of course, why there are redacted reports, national security secrets, and the House had access to all those materials anyway. But can you think of anything constituting less of a constitutional crisis, especially in a report that exonerates the president for the charges under which it was investigating him? Hyperbolic scare tactics. Then you get something that she did Tuesday night, shredding the State of the Union, and with it, everything in it, including a salute to a Tuskegee Airman who fought the fascists in World War II, his great-grandson, who wants to walk and travel in his footsteps, fly in his footsteps, I might say, fly on his wingspan. Military families being reunited, little urban area minority girls receiving scholarships to attend better schools, and a celebration of the life of a murdered victim of ISIS terrorism as delivered to her grieving parents. She ripped all of that up. That's a 1, especially when she doubled down on it by saying it was the appropriate thing to do. Think of what model she set for future speakers of the House, much less what memories she ruined of those who did nothing wrong but were given due attention by the country. They go home being celebrated in the State of the Union, the Speaker of the House ripped up, be you the parents of Kayla Mueller or General Charles McGee and his grandson, to so many others. You're at such a 1 on the scale because it's clear you are in a fit for not getting your way. Your way of first, electing a Democrat as president, and second, your way for not convicting a Republican who did less harm to our republic and national security than you yourself did when you flew to Syria to meet with and give credibility to Hafez Assad, the butcher of Syria, when the president, in that case George Bush, begged you not to, and she went anyway. So there's your scale. It moves from the innocuous but infirm to the commission of worse acts than those you try to denounce, all in the name of a fit, a tantrum, because you did not get your way, because you never learned that not everyone agrees with you. Now, you may ask, how is there no score or rating of 3, something right about in the middle? And the answer is, oh, there is. That's nearly Nancy Pelosi's or Democrats' every day, where they simply distort what we believe or what the president says to score a headline or a talking point or a political win. For example, if the president calls MS-13 the MS-13 gang members, the murderous thugs, if he calls them animals, which he did, and then Nancy Pelosi holds a press conference denouncing the president for referring to all illegal aliens as animals, which the president did not do, that's your everyday with the Democrats and Nancy Pelosi. Just standard, cheap, and sometimes truly gutter politics. Okay, we did you justice, and I hope we did you justice in explaining all this. Now, this gets me to something Peggy Noonan wrote today in the Wall Street Journal. By the way, I wanted to see what Peggy would say about Speaker Shredder Pelosi, because Peggy usually reveres institutions like States of the Union Address. She probably helped write some. And she didn't let us down today. She wrote this, quote, "The classy lady," Pelosi, "the classy lady was not classy. She forgot she has a higher responsibility than to her base, but to her country, the institution, the young who are watching and just getting a sense of how to behave in the world." Close quote. You see something you don't like or agree with? The speaker says it's just fine to rip it up. Great lesson there. It's a good point, how to communicate, how to be a political actor in this world. And if you learn from Nancy Pelosi, you learned what? That you can just shred and rip up that with which you disagree, no matter who else it may harm. But Peggy weighed in on something else in her column today, too, something we spoke a lot about, even this week. Given Ronald Reagan's birthday that we began to celebrate yesterday, she wrote this, quote, "Democrats, when they're feeling alarmed or mischievous, will often say that Ronald Reagan would not recognize the current Republican Party. I usually respond," Peggy says, "that John F. Kennedy would not recognize the current Democratic Party and would never succeed in it." Close quote. Peggy's half right. John Kennedy was a cold warrior who hated communism, and he was a tax-cutting radical who articulated the Laffer curve thesis about a decade before people like Jack Kemp and Ronald Reagan ran with it, or Art Laffer himself created it. But of Reagan, I think she's wrong. As I said the other day, if you think of 4 or 5 of Donald Trump's leading advocates in the country, say Laura Ingraham, Mark Levin, Bill Bennett, Dinesh D'Souza, Ed Meese, you have to quickly note they are some of the remnants of the highest places in the Reagan administration. Laura worked for Bennett. Bennett was in Reagan's cabinet. Mark Levin worked for Ed Meese. Ed Meese was Ronald Reagan's attorney general. Dinesh D'Souza was Reagan's domestic policy advisor. They might actually know what they're talking about in keeping the Reagan tablets, don't you think? But people remember what they want to, and conveniently never learn what they don't. They like the avuncular nature of Ronald Reagan, and yes, he was that, but he was something much bigger than just his personality. I mean, Hubert Humphrey and Tip O'Neill had personality, too. You go to Ronald Reagan's first calling card on the political scene, his time for choosing speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater in 1964. He never deviated from the things he said there, and people tend to forget that that speech itself was on behalf of Barry Goldwater, whom the Democrats ran an ad against, showing him blowing up the world with a nuclear bomb in front of the eyes of a girl picking flower petals. Pretty much the same kind of ad the Democrats ran against Ronald Reagan in 1984 in his re-election bid when they showed kindergarten students, it wasn't just one girl in this case, now it was a whole class of kindergarten students, looking out the windows of their school as Ronald Reagan blew up that same world with nuclear weapons. What did Reagan stand for? As much we should ask, what was it he didn't stand for? What did he stand against? He condemned socialism in the 1960s, just as he did in the 1980s. And in the 1960s, he would say things like socialism could even come from within our own government. Just as in the 1980s, he would declaim against too big a government. Does anyone remember his evil empire speech? Oh, sure. They recall him speaking of the Soviet Union as the focus of evil in the world. But do they recall the words before that, the whole context? Here it is, quote, "Let us pray for the salvation of all of those who live in that totalitarian darkness. Let us pray that they will discover the joy of knowing God But until they do, let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world. Close quote. How about his speech to the British Parliament, where he said, quote, "If history teaches us anything, it teaches self-delusion in the face of unpleasant facts is folly. We see around us today the marks of our terrible dilemma. Predictions of doomsday, anti-nuclear demonstrations, an arms race in which the West must, for its own protection, be an unwilling participant. At the same time, we see totalitarian forces in the world who seek subversion and conflict around the globe to further their barbarous assault on the human spirit. What then is our course? Must civilization perish in a hail of fiery atoms? Must freedom wither in a quiet, deadening accommodation with totalitarian evil?" Close quote. Of course, the answer was a resounding no. Let us pick up where Reagan left off. That's my plea and pitch. And with that which he gave us, resolve, a defense of the West, and a redounding to common sense that if we forget or abandon, we'll consign the human spirit to not just slavery but death. Let us fight so that, in Reagan's words, we never will have to spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like to live in a place called the United States of America, where men were free. I'm Seth Leibsohn. We'll be right back. I'd like to take a moment to tell you about my friends at Guns Etc. They are true American patriots. They strongly support our president, and they have over 10,200 square feet of firearms and firearm accessories. Please take my advice and stop by their store, which is a symbol of American freedom, or visit them at gunsetcetera.com and have access to over $350 million in firearms merchandise.